Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo. Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo. All right. I'm so tempted to do, I've been watching, I should have watched this years ago, but Check It Out with Dr. Steve Brule on HBO
Oh,
Max.
yeah.
Have you seen that? I never had seen that before.
Yeah.
And I love it. And I was just thinking it would be fun to do like the intro where he always turns around. And he gives you like some kind of quote. But yeah, so we could, because I wanted to start with where we ended last time, which is Stephen Batchelor's presentation of those four tasks. And just to begin, like he says, well, the traditional presentation, at least from the translation that he gives, is comprehend suffering, let go of the arising, behold the ceasing, and cultivate the path. But at the end of that last section we did last time, part 3, he says, Stephen Batchelor puts it in these terms: embrace life, let go of what arises, see it ceasing, and act. And I just want to start by saying that, like, I like that he gives both of those because it speaks to me in the sense that, like, I think a lot of times I worry, like, about even changing a word of a teaching I've heard. You know, like, if I've heard it said a certain way, like, am I allowed to do that? Honestly, like, still a fear I have sometimes.
Right.
Like, is that okay? You know, and I've come a long way in recognizing, like, I do think it's okay. And I think it's not only appropriate, but necessary a lot of times, depending on the context and depending on, you know, what else you've been talking to a person about or what's happening that day. Or, so yeah, I like that I admire the courage of taking these little leaps that he takes, because at the end of the day, like, this could be, even if you disagree with the way he presents things or the things he's saying, the act of contemplating whether this accords with the Dharma or the way the Dharma works in our own experience is Dharma. So, like, I think it's totally okay to read a thing and question, like, is this accurate? You know, and that's how we should be consuming it, regardless of the teacher, even if it's somebody we totally trust, who we think is saying exactly the words that were in the Pali Canon. We should equally be testing what we're hearing. And so I think it's you know, even more so if it's something that seems to be out on a limb potentially. That's a great, it can be a great tool for testing, you know, the accuracy of the Dharma you're hearing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's funny, like, just to consider, I mean, it seems to accord with everything that I've learned about Buddhism, that the way that we talk about the Dharma would naturally shift in subtle ways depending on the conditions, you know, in which it was being discussed. So makes good sense, I feel like. You know, it goes back to all sorts of little anecdotes, like even in this book, like the whole thing of what's appropriate, you know, or like making an appropriate statement as being somehow at the heart of the Dharma mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, even in the epigraph where it says, like, in each task, there are innumerable nuances, innumerable details, innumerable implications.
Yeah.
So we jump in today with part 4. This is where we start to get into the actual, each of the 4 tasks. And the first one here is suffering, dukkha, is to be comprehended, paranya. And he describes comprehension here as paranya as literally meaning total knowing. He says that the prefix pari, total, denotes around, roundabout, all around, or completely together. And he says such knowing is not concerned with the acquisition of knowledge about anything specific, but with a holistic comprehension of a situation at a given moment. The task of knowing requires considering one's situation from a range of different angles and perspectives. And that, to me, immediately translates as providing a counterbalance to our relative view. our relative situation. You know, if we want to have a total knowing of a situation, we need to think about each person's perspective, and we need to think about the past, and we need to think about the future. Maybe think is not the right verb here, but we need to be aware of all of the kind of interdependent factors arising in any given situation, and not get too fixated on any one of them. You know, that would not be, I think, the paranya he's talking about here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just, you know, the total, I like the total knowing, you know, or there's all sorts of total knowing, complete knowing, like recognizing all sides of life experience, you know, I guess is kind of how that comes across to me. And like that goes with the whole like embrace life, you know. I feel like, you know, it could be the case that maybe the traditional emphasis on suffering um, is perhaps an antidote to the fact that we tend to cling to the pleasant uh, side of things in life, and the suffering, pain related side of things is not usually what we want to think about. And that's sort of understandable in a way. Like even if I just say embrace life, like we, I don't know about everybody else, but in my mind, that almost comes across as like some kind of like just an affirmative, positive statement. You know? Embrace life, like it's almost, but like I mean, to embrace life is a massively complex task. You know, I mean, it is and it isn't. I mean, ultimately, I guess maybe it's simple, but um, anyway, part of what I'm kind of trying to get to, I guess, is like um, it's understandable in some ways that people might ask like, why do I need to think about suffering? Like, why do I need to embrace all sides of life? You know, why shouldn't we just focus on the positive and like basically just deal with the negative when we have to? And I don't think that's a stupid thing to suggest. Like, there's some intelligence in that for sure. But I think the issue is if we take that approach, we won't really be fully alive. That would be my way of kind of phrasing it to myself. Like, if we kind of try to never think about the negative side of life or the suffering, then we won't really be enjoying the things that we enjoy, you know, because they will not be taking place in a full picture of what is real.
Yeah.
I think that's the crucial point, actually, is like embrace life is like, yeah, like let's be honest about what's really here. And then maybe we can actually appreciate it. Otherwise, we're just kind of lying to ourselves and fooling ourselves for a while, maybe, but it won't last forever, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And when you said like embrace life, like first thing I thought is like some sort of like inspirational poster. You know, if you saw one that says embrace life, it would be like somebody zip lining, you know, or scuba diving. Right. You know, like it wouldn't be exactly. Like some like the effects of a war or like an, you know,
exactly
terrorist attack or something like, but that's life too, you know? And yeah, I agree. And I want to read to you the classical definition of dukkha, as Stephen Batchelor presents it, is birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, sickness is dukkha, death is dukkha, encountering what is not dear is dukkha, separation from what is dear is dukkha, not getting what one wants is dukkha. In short, these 5 bundles of clinging are dukkha. And he goes on to say, since paranya embraces birth, aging, sickness, and death, it is clearly existential in nature. Those with paranya are fully aware of having been thrown into this world at birth and of being constantly subject to illness and breaking down. They know that each breath is potentially the last. Comprehension of suffering is unsentimental and realistic. It recognizes that we are meeting what we do not like, losing what we cherish, and failing to get what we desire. And it is all encompassing. It includes every aspect of the sensory world, what we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, as well as our subjective reception of and response to this world, our feelings, perceptions, inclinations, and consciousness. That is the 5 bundles of clinging. And one thing that stuck out to me this time around was thinking about this, because we hear this phrase of birth, aging, sickness, and death a lot in the Buddhist texts. And what stuck out to me this time was thinking of that in terms of not just like literal birth, aging, sickness, and death, but as more broadly speaking, like beginnings and forward motion as like aging, things having this sense of moving and temporality, and sickness being like seemingly imperfect circumstances. Just meeting with circumstances are not exactly the way we would like them to be. And endings, things ending, birth, aging, sickness, and death. And so in any given moment, we're kind of experiencing that. So I think I'd always kind of had a little mental block because we talk about birth as being one of the elements of suffering, and I think it's a little obvious that that's probably traumatic for the baby and the mom. And I mean, birthing is traumatic, but I mean, I think it's even more applicable to think of it in terms of like new beginnings, a new thing coming into our experience. And like, what does that hold? And aging as being like change, and things continually moving and breaking down. And then sickness as being like, it could be physical, but like how often is there like just something that's not exactly how we would like it to be, and it's definitely affecting our perception and our interactions. And so I've never heard anybody else kind of present it this way, but that's what stuck out to me is like this idea that birth, aging, sickness, and death also covers these dynamics that are playing out at any given moment in life, not just birth, the beginning, and death at the end,
Yeah, that's awesome. I like that. It feels Trungpa like.
Yeah.
I feel like just maybe one other thing worth mentioning about this point of why we need to like embrace all sides of life is just that I think there's the issue of having compassion, like there's a way that we operate, I think, when we're in touch with all sides of life that is much more honest and true to who we really are than when we're just kind of looking in one direction and trying to not consider the pain and suffering. I think there's a really important process that takes place once we start to integrate maybe the things that we've tried to ignore previously, before being presented with this, like, look, stop kidding yourself, look at life as it really is. It's like, then you start to like, oh, okay, like all these sort of things get integrated into your awareness moment by moment, instead of this painful thing happens and you're blindsided because you never thought like, wait a minute, damn, like, rather than that happening, we're able to integrate that moment by moment and realize that actually you can kind of see the imprints of it everywhere, kind of like you're saying, right? It's like moment by moment, you can see these truths playing out, and then it sort of starts to like soften you or something, I think it's like, it's hard to walk around feeling like you've got everything figured out and like, just, I don't know. I think there's something that shapes us into a more honest person once all this starts to happen. And then on the other hand, I love the way he presents this. We talked about it, I guess, toward the end of the last episode a little bit, but just to acknowledge that it's not all about the suffering either. Like no one's denying joy and pleasure. And actually, I kind of think, right, that like being aware of the painful side of experience allows us to enjoy ourselves much more. You know, it may be as simple as just saying, now we know even more completely how precious those moments are, you know,
Yeah.
when we feel good or when beautiful things are happening, because it's not always like that, but when it is, let's enjoy it, you know. Yeah, so, and I think it just makes for a better presentation when we talk about dharma with people, to be able to say, look, we're talking about the whole picture here, you know.
Yes.
It's like,
Yeah, because I think that's where a lot of the issues with the secular mindfulness, that like siphoning out the mindfulness out of some kind of context, I think that becomes problematic, is because it becomes just about the good, you know, or the happy states,
right,
or feeling better, and fundamentally that's, according to these teachings, like that kind of reactivity to perceived negative circumstances is what's actually causing the suffering. So like if you're trying to just react to it with some sort of active effort at changing the situation till it feels positive, that's just going to get harder and harder, and the world's going to get more and more hostile. And
yeah,
and so I think that relates to the quote that that he shares here, with Gautama talking to Mahali. And he says, if Mahali, forms, feelings, perceptions, inclinations, and consciousness were exclusively suffering and pervaded by suffering, but if they were not also pervaded by pleasure, beings would not become enamored of them. But because things are pleasurable, beings become enamored of them. By being enamored of them, they are captivated by them. And by being captivated by them, they are afflicted. And Batchelor goes on to say here, Mahali failed to grasp what was different about Gautama's teaching. He assumed, as many would doubtless assume today, that the Buddha was talking about, or was talking from the enlightened standpoint of someone who has gained a correct understanding of the nature of things. This passage shows that the Buddha has no interest in describing what reality is. He is not a metaphysician or an ontologist. He wants people to start paying attention to features of their experience that they habitually overlook or ignore. His reason is entirely pragmatic. By not paying heed to the tragic dimension of life, we become enamored, seduced, and captivated by what is merely agreeable, which leads to cycles of reactive and addictive behavior that keep us trapped, frustrated, and afflicted. Comprehension, by contrast, encompasses the totality of what is happening. It is to embrace a life permeated equally by pain and pleasure, suffering and joy. And I think this relates to what's becoming a theme is my interval running experience, and waiting for the running intervals to end so that I could have the pleasurable walking intervals. And then the whole time I'm in my pleasurable walking interval thinking, oh no, the running interval's coming here soon. And so I think like one way I would describe this teaching here is that the shift is really to stop tuning out the unpleasant times with some sort of waiting or fantasizing about the pleasant times. I think a lot of times that's maybe the main distraction that we use to decorate our place of uncomfortableness, is to start to try to decorate it with all kinds of thoughts, concepts, and planning about how it's going to be when things are awesome. And so I think, again, the idea is to shift, the shift is to stop tuning out the unpleasant times, but instead to like equalize our awareness. So it's total and includes all the states of pleasantness, unpleasantness, and neutrality. And I think this ties in a lot with the analogies about the skilled craftsman. He revisits those ideas here. Side note, when I wrote in, when I was writing down my notes for this, and he mentioned the Aerosmith, I finally understood the band Aerosmith and the play of like arrow, AERO, and I was like, oh, it's like a plane, but it's like an arrow smith. Sorry, I had never really gotten that.
Yeah, I've never thought about that.
Yep. So arrowsmiths are a thing. They make arrows, but Aerosmith used the yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
It's never occurred to me. But back to the point, like I love the idea that that they are like craftsmen. And he uses the example, the one, because he talks about somebody like fashioning gold or something. And what stood out to me is he talked about the goldsmith like tending the fire. You know, sometimes you need to add some fuel, sometimes you add some air, but like sometimes he just watches it. You know, sometimes it's just the fire's good and you just let it go. You know, and I think that gets to some stuff we talk about a lot too, of this idea of like, it's not always like you have to do a thing. You know, like sometimes it's just things are just moving and you can just watch, you know, and the best thing to do is not, you know, that's, I think, coming up in the behold the ceasing kind of thing. But I mean, sometimes you stand back. Sometimes you have to actively do things and sometimes you don't. And I think that skilled craftsman kind of thing is like, they're always present. They know what they're doing. They know what might happen next, but they're not like presupposing it. They're just prepared to respond as need be and are letting the situation and the material and the objective guide their actions in each moment with that total knowing. So I love that analogy of the skilled craftsman as like crafting the self in a way.
Like one thing that I'm looking at here toward the end, which might be just good to mention while we're on the first one, you know, is that he talks about how like the 4 tasks are sort of 4 dimensions of one thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's like which area we're placing the emphasis on or something. It's like we're seeing the same situation, but like from what angle are we seeing it?
Yeah. Or like even like an old school like video game, you know, like you may have like the joystick, you can go forward, you can go back, you know, you can jump, you know, like in any given moment, like one of those things is going to be the thing, you know, like you don't always go forward, you're not always jumping, you know. But I also wanted to bring into this dialogue too, I think, because the idea here, especially with this analogy of like the skilled craftsman, is that this is like so much more than theory. You know, this is an activity. We're acting, you know, and that's how he describes that's the way he, in his own words, described the 4th task, act, you know. So I think with that in mind, like another takeaway I got from my summer visit to the Student Flourishing Teaching Workshop at University of Wisconsin was this idea of combining declarative and procedural learning and the importance of that. And before I really even had the terms for that, it's something I think I've always kind of done. Declarative learning being like telling somebody a thing and then hearing you tell them a thing and they acquire that knowledge, you know, or collect it. And procedural learning being like doing a thing, you know, and actually like learning from your own experience. We could maybe say experiential learning too. And that's something that I've started to try to do more often when I teach, because I think particularly in our tradition, frequently like a Dharma talk is all declarative, you know, and I think I've found that I enjoy giving a Dharma talk that uses procedural learning to demonstrate the declarative learning portions. You know, that if we're going to do some declarative learning, let's explore how that plays out in the experience of some mindful practice or meditation, you know. And I think that's important for a number of reasons, but maybe the biggest one is because having the experiential learning is so self driven, you know, like you have to do it yourself. And that means there has to be some kind of motivation to do it. So if you're not doing it with the person in the room, the odds that they're going to do it later are way down, So if you can, in the course of one presentation, give some declarative and some procedural, you've actually helped people understand things better, and maybe even given them the chance to ask a question about the procedural part so that when they do it later, it's more effective.
Yeah.
And I think that procedural is the meditation practice. And I mean, that is like the practices we talk about, the Buddhist, there's obviously some sort of philosophy and things that we're learning that are knowledge based, but it's really the experience needs to be a part of that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that your point, I feel like also kind of helps with sort of recognizing that our whole life process is kind of part of that. And I mean, that's important just because I think, it's helpful to feel like we're never wasting time. It's like our every moment is kind of part of this process of like, learning the craft, I guess, being a craftsman of applying this sort of view or whatever, or like, just becoming an experienced liver of life, and like with an eye toward like the wisdom quality, I guess. Yeah, it really is important, like to I guess be able to, really apply this stuff to life. And it's easy to kind of fail to do that, honestly. I feel like um maybe partially because there's a way in which it doesn't seem to obviously apply to every situation that we're in. I feel like that's one of the best qualities of this book is he's being like, no, this is about life as we live it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that, that's a great point. One suggestion that's coming to mind that I've engaged a lot is, I think so often we learn techniques or we learn these ideas, and then we really in retrospect, wish we would have remembered in the midst of greed or hatred. So when we're in a situation of like a lot of desire or a lot of aggression, like we think like, oh, I wish I would have remembered then, to do some practice or something. And I would suggest that I think actually the best place to do it is in the boredom, in the confusion. Those situations we often equate with like neutrality, and which means that they're going to be easier to practice in because they're already kind of an empty space, and I know I've probably said this before on the pod, but like I think one of my big, if there's one effect of our 3-year retreat, it's that I'm never bored anymore. Like I never,
right. Yeah.
Boredom is not a thing. That's not to say I don't check out or space out. But if I'm aware, in the moment, I'm never aware of boredom. Like there's always something I can do. And
right.
I'm always can be engaged with something. And so I like it is like a foreign thing for me to have an experience that I would label as boredom. Like there's always some kind of awareness I can cultivate or some kind of practice I can do. And I think that may have happened kind of by accident or as a byproduct of the practices we were doing. But I would definitely suggest that as the place if one is proactively trying to integrate the Dharma into life, do it with your sense of boredom. When you get bored, that's a great time to practice, and that's going to make it much easier for those things to be there in situations of the other two poisons, aggression and desire.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, because it's like, it's kind of more it's more like instead of us somehow summoning something in the moment of a heated reaction, it's like actually it's that it becomes something that we're so used to that it's then just there without having to conjure it up, you know?
Yes.
I would say one thing that I keep thinking of along these lines of conversation is even if we just, like, as you know, modern livers of life nowadays, even if all we did for like extracurricular uh off the cushion, so to speak, practice was every time that we would just reach for our phone to fill a gap in time, instead of getting on your phone, just like meditate for 30 seconds first. Just like look at your mind, and let that gap of experience take place. I mean, that actually is something that, I mean, I get on my phone plenty, but like that is something that, it's quite the contrast to like, the time we spend in retreat or whatever. Like I had no concept until coming home after retreat of like being on the phone a lot. And it really is kind of a crazy thing, like how much you start to just like use that to fill space, you know?
Yeah.
So that's probably something to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree 100%. That's something I tell people a lot too, is like one way to tune into senses is to try to, I mean, first of all, you can do it like right now, which is like, can you recall the feeling you have right before you find the phone in your hand? You're like, do you know what cues are causing what has become a mindless action of just grabbing the phone? Like, do you know, like, because there's some feeling before that. And I think I think it's a great practice of like trying to connect with what are you feeling in that moment. I mean, and specifically I'm talking about like sensory experience. Like what is the feelings in the body? What's that embodied sense that precedes the idea that we need the phone at that moment? And I mean, I can conjecture for myself, and I mean, and I think it is like there's a lull in conceptuality happening. There's a lull in conceptual inertia or motion, like input, we could say. Like all of a sudden there's less conceptual input, and we want to kind of keep that going, like that we feel like we need to fill that with more thinking. But generally when we feel busy, it's because of that fixation, that conceptual fixation. That's what makes us feel busy and overwhelmed. And so just getting on the phone causes more of that, as science is showing. I mean, this is not, I'm not giving away any big secrets. This is what we've all found out. Like, but so one thing that I've done and try to encourage other people to do is like kind of the same practice you're saying. Like when you have that urge to grab the phone, take a minute and put your attention on whatever you're feeling in your body, not picking up the phone. Like what are you sensing in that moment of abstaining from getting on the phone? And then if you can, like when you're ready to dive back into some concepts, label that feeling again and again as a friendly reminder that you have some free time.
Yeah.
Like I've got some free time in my day, because so often that what is actually literally almost in most cases a reminder that you've got some extra time on your hand becomes something reinforcing the idea that we're busy.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Eesh.
Yeah. So can we reframe that, and it's a really great practice. And I think like any abstaining, it doesn't have to be forever. It can just be 30 seconds or something. But if you are taking what is a mindless habit of grabbing the phone and taking even 10 seconds before you do it, you are interrupting the habit.
Yeah.
Like that's valid, even if you pick the phone up after that,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So this section, the only other note I have here is he says the Buddha asks at some point, somebody asked him, what is comprehension? And he answered, comprehension is the ending of greed, the ending of hatred, and the ending of confusion. And Stephen Batchelor makes the point that this is also how nirvana is defined. So he's already kind of introducing this idea that you mentioned earlier about how, this is all kind of different facets of the same thing. That brings us to section 5, which is about the arising. Samudaya is to be let go of. Pahana. And the arising here is equated with reactivity. And Batchelor says, we are creatures who react as we come into contact with the world through our senses. If what we meet feels pleasant, we react with attraction. If it feels unpleasant, we react with aversion. And if it feels neither pleasant nor unpleasant, we react with restlessness or boredom. To these reactions, we could add guilt, self-doubt, vanity, inadequacy, anxiety, conceit, paranoia, expectation, wishful thinking, and so on. Such reactions are entirely natural. They are neither good nor bad. Strictly speaking, they are not even ours. They are simply what happens when an organism interacts with its environment. They are what arises. And so the action here is to let go of those things, to let go of what arises. And as we said earlier, I think those reactions can be equated with the poisons of, whether we call it desire or greed, we're talking about the same thing, and that they're neither good nor bad. They're not particularly ours. Relates to the idea of that neurobiology that we've inherited, of having that sort of response to our environment. So the question then becomes, if we are to be aware of them and let go of them, is that a contradiction? How can we both embrace life and let go of what it contains?
Right.
And so he introduces the term tanha here, which he translates as reactivity, but it's literally thirst or craving. And the definition he gives is, this is the arising, samudaya. It is craving, tanha, which is repetitive, wallows in attachment and greed, obsessively indulges in this and that, craving for stimulation, craving for existence, craving for non-existence.
So, basically, Tana is our reaction to life. That is pretty subtle distinction, I suppose. Yeah.
Do you think samudaya and tana, the arising and do you think those two are I think because the way he words it here, this is the arising, samudaya. It is craving, tanha. So I feel like that's one of those co-emergent things, like the one of them that we have control over is the tanha. You can let go of the tanha, but the samudaya is going to be there. The arising is going to be there. We can let go of the reactivity.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's kind of like almost like the Tana is the arising from our point of view. You know what I mean? Like it's like the arising. It is one thing, but like the reaction is like our point of view of the thing arising, kind of like it's like perceiver and perceived.
Yeah.
Which I feel like kind of gets back to, to me, that sort of works along the lines of like kind of the insight that the reactions that we have are not necessarily ours. You know,
Yeah.
they're kind of just like what happens under certain circumstances.
Yeah. I like this quote. He says, Tanha as an element within the classical doctrine of the 12 links of conditionality is what arises in reaction to the feelings that come from sensory contact with a differentiated world of a conscious being. The reactions include hatred and indifference, loathing and boredom, as much as craving and desire. Nor is the arising of Tanha just a series of isolated events. It is a self-reinforcing cycle. A conscious being wallows and indulges in worries, fears, obsessions, and fantasies. In response to a gnawing sense of lack, Tanha supports a yearning to fill the inner void with ever more intense stimulation. Rooted in feelings of existential incompleteness and inadequacy, it inflates the ego and affirms one's importance in the world. And whenever these strategies fail to deliver, it lapses into a hankering for intoxication, oblivion, and even death. A little later on, he says, in this way, reactivity both amplifies the pain initially experienced and triggers proliferating thoughts.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of, I mean, if we think about them just from the standpoint of all of these being like kind of all of one piece, you know, like different aspects of the same thing. I feel like it's almost like moving from embracing life or the total knowing of life. It's like almost the impulse to like make that personal, you know?
Say more.
Well, like, it's like all of this whole like spectrum of reaction, uh, I guess based on the perceived split between subject and object, you know? And it's like, rather than just like the total comprehending awareness of the situation, then we are like seeing it from our side mostly. And then that could kind of go to all these different places of how we sort of make that content part of our story or part of our existence. I mean, the impulse to grab the phone, I feel like really belongs here, right? Like that's
Yeah.
kind of the, yeah, I mean,
Because we
I don't
could just
know.
be present with whatever that feeling is that precedes it. But instead, we try to
Yeah.
actively shift it. We react
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
with desire
Um,
or hatred of not having the phone in our hand.
yeah. And I'm thinking too of just all the, like, I mean, this category seems to even, it would include like, let's say we like get on social media, right? And like start taking in all this information. And then this, uh, the reaction aspect includes all of the thinking of like comparisons to other people that we might get into, like I'm not good enough, uh really anything that involves um like the juxtaposition of ourselves with whatever we're perceiving, you know, it could go in like any direction.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love this idea of like amplification and proliferation. Like there's an experience and then we amplify it with thinking about it, you know, and that thinking about it also proliferates more thought. And in each of these kind of steps, we're getting away from the embrace, you know, like we're no longer holding, we're kind of distancing ourselves with thought.
Right.
And he uses the analogy here too, that it's like Tana is like fish hooks or snares, because like once we get hooked, if we try to get out of it, if we're struggling to get out of it, that actually could be, he says, just another form of reactivity that we're struggling against, you know? So it self perpetuates itself. And I think maybe the answer here, like the let go here, is really, you know, again, like a presentness, you know, like we can notice the reactivity, and that if we're going to struggle against it, that's more reactivity. But we could also just kind of notice it and embrace it and let go of it, which gets at, because I think he goes a little bit later here into the embrace and the letting go as a dance, is the metaphor. But I think we kind of have to introduce that now, because that's really the idea. It's like it is a holding in, but it's also a letting go, and there has to be some give and some take to that process, that act, you know.
Yeah, definitely. I'm coming across this point that is also applicable now, where I think this is really important. He's using the terms inner and outer specifically, and instead of subject and object. And I feel like that kind of speaks to that whole thing of how, like, if you, from the point of view of inner and outer, it's more like a situation that arises with those different aspects, rather than there being a subject who experiences the object of experience.
Yes.
I feel like that's kind of like the crucial point here, actually, because I'm looking here over on this other page where he talks about how once we get into those like obsessive webs of thought, it's like basically what it does is leads us to be more and more self-centered, right? All that stuff is reinforcing this idea of a self, which really doesn't exist. It's very ephemeral. Like there's no real solidity to it, but the more we believe that it's solid, the more we're going to operate based on that. Whereas the way to like nip that in the bud is to really start recognizing, you know, it goes back to the point at the very beginning, like these reactions are not even particularly ours.
Yeah.
You know, it's all that same insight. It's like it's this thing that is arising from one aspect of the experience, more like the inner side of it, as opposed to the outer. But, you know, the more that we recognize that they're not our perceptions, I think, the better. It's very sort of freeing. And like, I think about that too. Like, I don't know where I came across this the first time, but I mean, I just remember like being so encouraged and kind of freed up by the teaching that like the thoughts that go through your head are not particularly like your thoughts. I mean, there's so much, that's like a profound territory of mental health, you know, like I feel like part of the sort of thing that drives people crazy is that they start to think that because they're having a certain kind of thought, they become so identified with it because they think that is them, you know? Whereas if we recognize that our, you know, mental atmosphere is actually much more sort of porous, it's like those thoughts just come and go. None of them are you, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that point came out of another one of these cultural context tips or insights that he gives, that and I think the way he said it was that he has to keep reminding himself that the Buddha, at the time of the Buddha, there was no presupposed split between an experiencing subject and an objective world.
Right.
And that was this kind of sentence that I had to go back and reread several times, because that's so ingrained in the way we think about things, you know, and that was not the way they were thinking about it then. And he even goes on to say that like the terms subject and object do not appear in the discourses. You know, the Buddha will talk about an inner experience or an outer experience, but this idea of subject and object was not a part of the teachings of the Buddha. Like that was not the way they thought at that time. So we have to be really careful about kind of turning these teachings into psychology. And I think the example he uses is like, if we're feeling upset, we feel like the world is this angry, hateful place. And then we start to think, well, if I can just change the way I'm thinking, then the world will be transformed. And frankly, I feel like I've taught these kind of things, because I hadn't thought of it in this way before, that we can transform the world by transforming ourselves. And there's some truth to there. There's a middle way truth to that. But like, we have to recognize, I think with particularly, I guess, when we're looking at what the Buddha said or taught, that it is all of it needs to be handled. Like the total comprehension needs to be taken into account. It's not just that we can change one or the other and the other will change. It's a totality.
Yeah. I mean, there's just like a lot in that paragraph. I'm kind of trying to skim through there a little bit.
You can read it if you want.
I was just looking at the part that says, we tend to regard the appearance of such a fearful world as a projection of our mental state. But this reading of the situation is based on the cultural habit of interpreting experience psychologically. No matter how much we tell ourselves that the fearfulness of the world is just a projection, such reassurance does not significantly alter either how the world appears to us or how we feel about it. From the perspective of a Dharma practitioner, the task of letting go of what arises entails releasing one's grip on the whole picture. Angry me facing hostile situation. Letting go is not simply a question of breathing deeply to calm my rattled mind. I need to cleanse the doors of my perception. This requires suspending the default habit of seeing the world as being hostile, desirable, or boring. One of the most effective ways of suspending that habit is to train yourself to comprehend the world as an infinitely suffering world. I know I wrote down in my notes that little quote of we need to cleanse the doors of perception.
Yeah, a little Jim Morrison nod.
Yeah, rather than just calm down, I mean, that is kind of like, I love that, because I mean, that is like the scope of the task. There's so many different ways that we could try to communicate like the deep existential import of these teachings, because I mean, so much of the way I think they come across in popular culture is just like a matter of just like chilling out, basically. And it's kind of, I don't know, my knee-jerk reaction to that is to be kind of annoyed by it, because it presents such a shallow picture of what's involved, and also it presents such a shallow picture of where they could actually lead you. You know what I mean? Like the actual results are so much more far-reaching and incredible, really, than just like I'm kind of more chill and can like be calm when I walk through the store or something. I mean, I don't know. My point though is just that I'm encouraged by any kind of language or presentation of this stuff that is able to like communicate the gravity of it in a relatable way,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think you got at this, you said something about this earlier today too, which is the idea that like there's a reason why we cultivate this view of the world as infinitely suffering. And it's not because there is nothing joyful in the world. It's because we're fixated on one of the seemingly two polar opposite things, because we're fixated on the desirable. We have to counterbalance that towards the suffering. And that is in no way a claim that you can't be happy, or that some things don't feel nice. But yeah, I think that, and this is, I think, where he brings in that idea of the dance. The fourfold task entails cultivating an embrace that is also a release. This action is akin to a dance where each partner holds the other so that both can move with optimal freedom and grace. The more we fully understand the precarious and mysterious situation we are in, the more our egocentric reactivity will either die down of its own accord or appear increasingly petty and absurd. And the more we stop believing what our compulsive mental habits keep telling us, the more the world will tend to reveal itself in all its poignancy, tragedy, and sublimity. I'm going to keep reading because this is good. He says, letting go of reactivity is a consequence of comprehending reactivity. In many of the dialogues with Mara, the Buddha concludes by saying, I know you, Mara, whereupon Mara vanishes. With such comprehension, here explicitly compared to knowing a person, the practitioner sees the tricksterish wiles of reactivity for what they are, the seductive infantile play of an organism that is primarily, and for the most part redundantly, preoccupied with its biological survival. In one exchange, Mara declares to the Buddha, life is long, live like a milk-sucking baby. Gautama retorts, life is short, live as though your head were on fire. This passage highlights how reactivity is an instinctive behavior that will persist as long as we inhabit the body with which we were born. To release oneself from the hold of this behavior requires coming to a mature comprehension of one's mortality, of how each fragile moment rests upon the pumping of a muscle and the drawing of a breath. And that's how he closes part 5. Ready to go on to part 6?
Yeah.
Cool. So now we're getting into the ceasing. Nirodha is to be beheld. And he says the third facet of the fourfold task is to behold the ceasing, which is equivalent to becoming aware of nirvana. Here's the classical definition of ceasing. This is the ceasing, the traceless fading away and ceasing of that reactivity, tanha, and letting go and abandoning of it, freedom and independence from it. This succinct description allows for nirvana to be understood in one of two senses, either as the ceasing of tanha or as freedom and independence from tanha. So he introduces this idea that we can see it in two ways. It's either like a final thing that is only available to like fully realized, accomplished Buddhist meditators, or it is like something that can be seen by anyone because it's our ground. And whether Buddhist or not, or meditator or not, whenever greed, hatred, and confusion are momentarily inactive, we see nirvana. And I think his argument is basically like there are a lot of places where the Buddha talks about it in that second context, that this is a ground, this is all of our ground, and we can see it whenever those three poisons are have ceased momentarily. And that the first view may be more in line with orthodoxy, but that doesn't necessarily make it correct,
Something that jumps out to me is just that, like, there's a way in which they're kind of both true together, potentially. I mean, the second viewing is probably more practically useful for us at the current time. But I mean, I would say that, like, theoretically, through familiarization, right, with that occasional cessation that we experience, it could be the case that eventually we inhabit that at all times. I don't know. But, then even so, this may kind of be following the thread along to the fourth task a little prematurely, we might get there. But I would be inclined to think though that like even if we were to reach a point where we're like firmly in the place of cessation without really straying from it, that there would still be content. I mean, it's not like empty, vacant experience, because that gets into the whole like you would still like skillfully act, right? Like the whole act being like skillfully use thought processes and whatnot. You would just know what they are. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and there's that awareness that arising is still there, but there's this idea that and even our initial reactivity, like the initial response to the arising, before we've turned our attention to it and our volition to it, those things we can observe, and yeah, and I think that that content that you're talking about, that exists independently from our actions or thoughts, or that I think I like that idea of nirvana being like we can still see the reactivity, but we are no longer affected by it. It still exists next to us. And another quote I highlighted here is he says, unless we regard nirvana as clearly visible to ordinary people and accessible to them as a perspective from which they can live their everyday lives, it would be difficult to understand how beholding cessation could be an integral part of a fourfold task that is open to all. To behold and thus become aware of nirvana means consciously to affirm and valorize those moments when you see for yourself that you are free to think, speak, and act in ways that are not determined by reactivity. Nirvana is a space of moral possibility, the gateway to an ethical life. And I like that idea of affirming and valorizing, because like that's one thing that I try to ask people sometimes. It's like, do you know a time where you were just fully present and felt like you fully had control of your decisions, and just felt like anything was possible, or just were fully present and not thinking at all. I think there are moments where we've all had glimpses of nirvana, and I know Khenpo Carter Rinpoche has told me that too. Like may not be frequent for everybody, but we've all had those experiences. We've all seen that at some point. And so I think I like the idea of affirming and valorizing those moments. So rather, because I think another way to look at those moments could be, oh, I only had that happen once, and
right.
almost like a negative. And it's like, no, if you've had that, that's great. That's your rocket fuel, like hang on to that,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, it just occurs to me like that, to kind of recognize that everyone probably has some area where they're like getting into this sort of recognition from the point of view of like maybe someone, like ourselves, like maybe formally associated with Dharma. That helps me to sort of just like keep pure view, sacred outlook in mind. Like we're all kind of we're all in this together. Everybody's right there. It's not just me with my little practice.
Yeah.
I mean, that's good for so many things, like pure view of the world and its inhabitants, and also like just humility. I thought about that earlier, just like, we're all kind of equal in terms of our ultimate nature. That's a good thing to keep in mind. Nobody's better than anybody else, or even maybe not even any further along. Like, what if, it's like, what if, because I need a practice, maybe I'm the one that's slow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just kind of just like a funny way to look at it, but like it could be true. It's like, okay, maybe everybody else is already there, just waiting for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
The darn meditators.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And
I don't.
there was also the other quote that I had here was that the experience of nirvana becomes possible even when in the throes of reactivity itself. And it actually there was some concept that you tipped me off to while we were in retreat about how like sometimes when you recognize that you have been maybe not practicing in the way that you'd like to, or you've been unaware or whatever, like that moment is actually considered, an awakened moment. Like in that moment, like you can see reactivity happening, but because you're aware of it and not beholden to it, like you can actually have an authentic experience of that, of nirvana. And I love that this chapter in really this whole book is about highlighting these regular people, householders, and he brings up the 21 examples of people who were just in regular everyday life that managed to attain enlightenment and live life from its perspective. And I think I need to hear that stuff, because I think particularly in our world, like if we're thinking of everyday life, we're going to meet a lot of arising, and that arising is going to have a lot of pleasantness and unpleasantness, and the reactivity will inevitably come with it because it's our biological inheritance. So, we still got a chance, even with all of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not just a chance, but many countless chances.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember the instant that you're talking about. I think somewhat, and I feel like it was, it may have been Gampopa actually, like a teaching about like, even if you go through the whole night's sleep in just like having ordinary dreams, like, like not being able to bring the Dharma mind into the dream world. It's like, even if you just have a whole night of ordinary dreams, first thing when you wake up, if you remind yourself, right, like that was all just like the illusory play of my deluded mind, then it's like, okay, like you're right there, and that may sound like, it sounds almost like too simple, but if we really think about it, it's like, that's always true. Like, it's really based on the fact that no matter what has happened previously, when you really come to an authentic moment of awareness, that's it right there. It doesn't matter what has happened previously. It really doesn't.
Yeah.
Like none of it really leaves any kind of real imprint on that pristine mind.
Yeah.
It's all gone. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you had a whole session of good practices the day before. Nothing touches that, good or bad, really.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if I can find it. I know it was what you introduced me to was something in Moonbeams of Mahamudra. And it had a term. It started with an L.
Oh, yeah.
But it was basically that like moment of awakening when you recognize you were distracted. That idea of like
right.
And I forget what it was called, but yeah, that was it. I thought I had it bookmarked, but I don't. But yeah, I think that's I love this idea of this being like nirvana and this framing of it as being available to us. And so another quote I've got here is, to behold nirvana is to realize that one is not beholden to the prompts of sensual desire, being, and ignorance. Yet the freedom enabled in this non-reactive space does not occur in a vacuum, but within the context of the 6 sense fields of a living body, which are not empty at all, but full of both anxiety and possibility. The challenge of beholding what ceases is to learn how to live in and from the perspective of such emptiness, the abode, as Gautama put it, of the great person, all the while engaging with the world that is constantly and unpredictably impacting one's senses, triggering cascades of reactivity. And he goes on to say, one of the oldest passages in the canon from the chapter of eights, that was cited above as an example of a skeptical voice, says, wrong-minded people do voice opinions, as do truth-minded people too. When an opinion is stated, the sage is not drawn in. There is nothing arid about the sage. And earlier in this chapter, he talks about aridity as being like the state of greed and aggression and confusion. He presents that as being like the opposite of the fertile ground of nirvana.
There was one other, I thought, interesting thing in this little section was just the, there's this whole idea of like the deathless.
Yeah.
Like, which is connected to like the term that we've heard and said a bajillion times, Amrita, like the nectar of eternal life or deathlessness or whatever. So I might just read a couple parts if that's cool. So he talks about deathless. The word amata is also defined as, quote, the ending of greed, hatred, and confusion, thus making it synonymous with both nirvana and comprehension. This passage affirms how people fully engaged in the world as, quote, seers of the deathless had not only become aware of nirvana, but lived their lives from its perspective. So, I mean, basically, if my understanding is right, it's like that which is deathless is, basically like the empty awareness or the whatever we want to call the aspect of the twofold ground that is like free, basically. So just to go on, it says deathless is another word for abundant life. If we think of Mara as death, then no longer, then to no longer be constrained by his armies is to be freed to live fully. Gautama does not think of the deathless as immortality, as the term is understood in Brahmanism, but as the positive absence of reactivity. So that kind of goes to that, perhaps he is playing on the mythic sense of amata, like Sanskrit amrita and its Greek cognate ambrosia, as the divine nectar that grants eternal life. Pretty cool stuff. But then in the first sentence of the next paragraph, he just simply states, kind of like as a, I feel like, clarification of all that, he says, the person who is aware of the deathless is one who dwells in emptiness. That would not die. So that's all pretty good stuff. And I mean, it fits with the ideas that we like touched on at various points earlier too, of like how to be in comprehension of these things and to have this insight is the way in which we live fully. It's full living,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that ties in with what's right at the end of the chapter too, which is this idea of aridity as getting trapped in opinion or staking out positions. And he says, where is it? The sage is concerned not only with what impacts his physical senses, but with words and concepts that impact his mind. He is on guard against seductive ideas, compelling images of the world that seem to explain everything, and beliefs that provide heartwarming consolation. The problem with such ideas, images, and beliefs does not lie in whether they are true or false. There is something about the very way in which a concept is structured that limits and imprisons us. And he goes on a little bit later to say, this healthy suspicion of opinion prevents the sage from getting drawn into agreeing or disagreeing with the stated view. He may consider what was said in terms of its usefulness, whether it is appropriate for dealing with a situation at hand or resolving a specific dilemma, but he does not let himself get lured into disputing whether it is true or false in any final metaphysical sense. The sage has left behind the aridity of place. He no longer seeks certainty and finality to bolster the security of his ego. A sage lives from the fertility of a ground that responds creatively and spontaneously to the unfolding conditions of life. And the note I made here is like the opposite, or the seeming opposite here of like place being like certainty and finality, and ground being creativity and spontaneity.
Yeah, that's cool. It's cool to kind of think too, like from the point of view of resting in the ground, then place, the way place develops can also be kind of playful and creative. Like they're not really two different things. Yeah,
you still go places on the ground, but you can do it with creativity and spontaneity rather than looking for certainty or finality. Yeah. All right, so part 7, the path, magga, is to be cultivated, bhavana. And he introduces this by saying, he gives the Buddha's description of the path, and it is, and this is the path with 8 branches: complete view, complete thought, complete speech, complete action, complete livelihood, complete effort, complete mindfulness, and complete concentration. And Stephen Batchelor points out, I translate samma as complete rather than the more usual right. It is what the term literally means. The phrase samma sambuddha, for example, means a completely awakened one, not a rightly awakened one. Complete lacks the moralistic overtones of right and suggests how each element of the path can become an integral part of a whole. Integral is from the Latin integer, entire. The Eightfold Path is a model for a centered life which is balanced, harmonious, and integrated instead of imbalanced, discordant, and fragmented. It is not a recipe for a pious Buddhist existence in which the practitioner does everything right and gets nothing wrong. So I see that as like it's about ground, not place. It's built for creativity and spontaneity. It's built for that appropriate statement. It is not certainty or finality, which I think I would relate certainty or finality, just from my view, with a lot of what religion is. So I think there's another place to be careful.
Like I kind of, I guess, think of this as like almost like skillful means or something. Like life becomes your means to integrate, insight or something, like bring it to life. It seems like, I guess, the final logical conclusion of all this is to have your insights completely integrated with ongoing real experience and life.
Yeah, for sure. I'll read another quote here. He says, somebody's asking the Buddha, you say complete view. What is this complete view? And Gautama replies, by and large, Kachana, the world relies on the duality of it is and it is not. But one who sees the arising of the world as it happens with complete understanding has no sense of it is not about the world. And one who sees the ceasing of the world as it happens with complete understanding has no sense of it is about the world. We kind of have to talk that way, at least the way our language is developed. But this idea of anything, existing or not existing is really not capturing the way our experience works.
Right. Yeah.
Accurately at all, and in many ways causing us a lot of suffering.
Yeah, definitely.
And we could relate that to the is the right thing to do or is not the right thing to do, or.
Yeah, that's really a good insight to translate it, I guess, is complete, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Which harkens back to the first one in a way, the total knowing, total
yeah, yeah,
awareness.
true. Yeah, I was just looking at this line that says, to sustain such a complete view is a challenging task.
Oh, one last little quote about that. He says, bearing witness to the arising and unfolding of something renders absurd the notion that it is not. Similarly,
Hmm.
contemplation of its fading away and disappearance undermines any notion that it is.
Right. So, I mean, how do you think this all kind of has to do with having an accurate view of things, I suppose. So like when in this fourth part, his phrasing of it is just like act, you
Yeah.
know. So I mean, how do we bring that together, I guess? Is it just like, you know, we continue on acting in light of this view? I mean, what do you take the point to be there?
I'm thinking of the section of Shantideva's The Bodhisattva's Way of Life where he keeps repeating like be like a log. Like there's a section of that where he kind of says like if this happens, if somebody says something really mean to you, be like a log, and basically the
Mm.
implication is do nothing, or if
Hmm.
something
Hmm.
really great happens, be like a log, and it's just be like a log, be like a log, and I would see that as a counterbalance to acting, like doing a thing,
Hmm.
and I think
Hmm.
my biggest takeaway I think from this journey through the four tasks is like that last one, that is the acting. But the idea is it is one of four options of how to deal with any
Hmm.
given situation. Whereas I think what we
Hmm.
always try to do is act. I mean, I think that's whether it's
Right,
thinking or
right.
figuring out or changing or persuading, like we're just always in this mode of acting. And I like the idea that
Mhm.
like the last one explained here is how to act in the context of the four tasks after we've already learned about comprehending, letting go, and beholding, which are three things that are not really particularly active things, and I like that
Mhm.
that is kind of the last one's also the shortest in that formulation. It's just act,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
sometimes when you have to act, you act and you want it to be with those complete kind of views. But I think that those complete view of complete livelihood, complete mindfulness, those all flow from um, comprehending, total knowing, letting go of Tana. So yeah, I
Mhm.
that's kind of my takeaway, I think, from this run through these.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I was reminded that at the end of this section, he does kind of get into like a little bit of a discussion of ethics, which is I thought was really good, and it may be like a good place to go, just in the sense that I guess like ethics in a way, it's a way of talking about how we might act, right? Like the way in which we might go about acting. Um, and I just really loved what he said. There was something I wrote down, um, which is that I think in here, I'll read a paragraph here in a second, but I know that he just sort of describes what we might call like Dharma ethics or something as an ethics of care and risk, which
Yes.
was like, I thought that was like really beautiful. And then basically he was saying sort of like a situational ethics based on compassion and empathy, you know. Those are really I mean, that's just really great. Like it makes the process of acting ethically in the world actually like realistic, and it somehow comes across to me as so much more true, right, than like following like a rule book,
Mm-hmm.
That was something that I always struggled with. Like, somehow it's like on a certain level, we know that it's not quite skillful to just like carry around a set rule book and just like apply it to every situation. It's like just not, it can't be right.
Yeah, it's
That's how I felt.
caused a lot of destruction and
But
suffering in the world doing that.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Um, okay, so I'm just going to read that last paragraph, I guess, if that's okay
Mm-hmm.
with you, because I feel like it's really good. And just again, to like come back around to, I mean, I think it's good as far as illustrating how we might act, or like making the whole reality of like acting in light of the four tasks practical or animated. So, for one who no longer thinks in terms of it is and it is not, there can be no ontological basis for ethics. Okay. It's like, whoa, where's he going? A legalistic moral code, by contrast, tends to be based in the assumption that bad actions have a certain intrinsic nature, whereas good actions have a quite different nature. Those who are moral, therefore, follow the rules laid out in this code with the complacent assurance of knowing they are right. But those who have entered the stream of the path have become independent of others, uh, not being tied to a code of conduct devised by others. They will respond in unpredictable ways to whatever moral dilemmas they encounter. They will do so with empathy, intelligence, and compassion, not by first checking with a moral rule book to see what is allowed. They will recognize how each moral dilemma arises out of a unique blend of complex conditions. Their ethics is thus situational rather than legalistic. They are willing to make what they consider to be an appropriate response, fully aware that they might get it wrong, might make things worse. They are no longer tied by moral rules, but have embraced an ethics of care and risk. Um, yeah, I really like that a lot. And it goes back to some of the um, consistent things we've talked about throughout all of this. Most notably, I feel like the whole making an appropriate statement idea, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. The only other thing I wanted to make sure I get this quote in there too. I like how he says, in talking about the Buddha, he says he is comfortable with the language of process, but rejects the language of ontology.
Mm.
Because that reminds me of, one of the most meaningful quotes I remember kind of cutting through for me was in Tralek Rinpoche's Karma, where he says something similar, where I think he says, like, we often use thing language where we should use process language. And that always really stuck with me.
Yeah, that's good.
And then we get to the last part 8. I didn't really make any notes here. I just said the metaphor of the city. So he kind of puts the city as like the 5th task, so that we comprehend dukkha, let go of reactivity, behold the ceasing of reactivity, cultivate the Eightfold Path, and then we build the city. So I think the what I took from this was his idea that this was about creating a society, a better society, a better community of people. And I like that the idea is that you do the 4 tasks first, and then go about building the city, because I just kind of hear that as like, you got to work on yourself first.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I wrote down something about, like the city could be sort of seen as metaphorical, like the city, divine city within, so to speak.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Not that it's, it's like both. I sort of think of it, to me, like the main thing I thought of in this section was, Shambhala, Trungpa's Shambhala, and all the considerations with that. Like, is it a real place? Is it inside of ourselves? Is it kind of both? Is it something between? Is it something that we enact in our everyday life all the time with our companions now?
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's a principle more than anything else.
Yeah.
But that was kind of an interesting point. There's these like threads, I feel like, from this book that Trungpa definitely was weaving, like
Yes.
from this early, like, basic, fundamental, elemental kind of Dharma. He was, I feel like I've learned through this book how in touch Trungpa was with, just this like basic, essential Dharma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I don't know that I have anything else. I had a couple. The only other thing I had highlighted in here was where he says conditionality and nirvana provide the underlying rationale for living in the world in a way that fosters individual integrity and the renewal of community. In comparing the aim of his teaching to the rebuilding of an ancient city, the Buddha presents his goal as something entirely secular. According to Buddhist orthodoxy, following the Eightfold Path leads to the complete end of suffering by bringing the cycle of death and rebirth to an end. Here, in contrast, following the Eightfold Path leads to the emergence of a city, a collaborative civic life in this world. And may it be so.
Yeah.
That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Good stuff.
Well, yeah, this was a marathon session. This is definitely the longest Lama Tsabut session, but like, there's a lot to talk about in there for sure.
Yeah, definitely. It was the longest one.
I'm sure we've never done a session that long.
Yeah.
But it was worthwhile. I had a great time. Any other thoughts before we wrap the episode?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, we'll see y'all next week for Passinity. Take care, y'all.